You're listening to Foodagogy, where we explore what food can teach us about becoming totally inclusive schools. I'm Angeline Au, and I believe that dynamic conversations about inclusion, diversity, and equity happen around the table. Every episode, I sit down with someone whose relationship with food reveals something essential about identity, community, and belonging, the same things we're trying to cultivate in our classrooms. Whether you are wrestling with inclusion in your institution, a foodie, curious about culinary cultures, or simply someone who believes that every child deserves to thrive at school, you belong here. Thank you for tuning into these food-related conversations that nourish both heart and pedagogical practice. Divya Ravindranath is currently pursuing a master's in integrated food studies at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. Divya formerly studied politics, philosophy, and economics at Ashoka University in India. And she writes, researches, reads, cooks, and also dances. Divya argues that while food can humanize, create spaces of trust and vulnerability over a shared meal, that food can also be a powerful tool in perpetuating nationalism and propaganda. And so I'm very excited to have Divya as our guest in our first episode. And so tell us more about you, Divya. Share with us your early food memories.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. Yeah, so I have a background in politics, philosophy, and economics, but my sort of interest in food started at a very young age. I'm just always, I think it started from a place of just really loving like how food brought everybody in the family together and just really loving like the way that my grandmothers and my mother, like everybody, how much they partook in the activities around food. So it started from that place. And then as I grew older, I think I also just started noticing all the other systems around which food is embedded in. And then when I was studying my undergraduate degree, I took a few courses um, that allowed me to explore food academically a little bit more. And then that led to my interest in the program that I'm currently studying in, which is, like you said, a master's in food studies at University of Copenhagen. And yeah, so that brought me here. And yeah, so some of my early food memories, though, like I said, I think a lot of it has been around my family and my grandmothers specifically, because growing up, my parents, both of them went to work. So that meant that my dad's mom sort of would take care of me as I was really small. But then as I grew older, I think our roles sort of shifted and it went from her sort of warming up food for me after I'd come back home from school to me warming the food up when I would come back as I grew older, because it just got more challenging for her to, do those activities herself. Also, other memories of my grandmother making it's this dish called rasam from the south of India. It's essentially this tamarind, really spicy sort of liquid that you can have with rice or just drink itself. To make this rasam, you essentially prepare the liquid first, and then you have to add this like tempering of like curry leaves and mustard and everything. So the smell of that tempering sort of takes over the house, and you can tell when it's being made. So my one of my strongest memories is as a child just sort of sitting in a random corner of the house, but then I'd hear the tempering being made and I'd hear the sizzle of that liquid being added to the oil and everything, and I just know that rasam was being made. And then I'd rush into the kitchen, and my grandmother would already have like a glass of it set aside for me to have because I just really enjoyed drinking it. Things like that I think about, I think, like when I think about food and where it all started for me.
Thank you so much for sharing. I love how you described how food memories can be instigated by not only, in our minds cognitively, but also through just smelling something
Yeah.
or hearing, the act of something tempering.
Yeah.
And it sounds to me like food played a really big role in your family as you were growing up, that brought your family together. And the act
Yeah.
of actually preparing food is a a care responsibility
Yeah. Yeah.
of someone caring for you, and then as the years went on, you then caring for your
Yeah.
grandmother.
Yeah. Exactly.
You've also written about how food brings people together, how it
Mm.
ties people together under a shared sense of identity and love. Can
Yeah.
you tell us more about the intersection between food and identity?
So, I mean, I think what makes food such a strong carrier of identity is the fact that it is what I think it's like super mundane and very like banal in the sense that it's everywhere and it's very obvious and it's very regular. So people don't think of it as something that carries weight. But I think it's because of that mundaneness or because of its obviousness that it just becomes so powerful because it's just this like, omnipresent vehicle of like all stories and all care. I think this sort of characteristic of it makes it like very easy for people to connect over. I think the biggest example of like, food and identity is just how social groups are formed and how they are retained, and how they remain cohesive or how they remain like stratified. And I think all of that happens through dictating like food habits, like who gets to eat what and who doesn't get to eat something. And I think those are kind of the rules that make up social groups or social even hangouts, I would say. Like it's a strong forger of identity. Also, I think on a personal level, like I would say that there are certain amounts of foods that make me who I am, that make me a like myself, and B maybe an Indian. Like it makes me like this. And now that I've moved to Copenhagen, I also have these other foods that have been added to my list of like things that make me who I am. So it's like you can allow it to develop all these layers around who you are because of its like everyday feature. Like everybody has to eat, everybody has eaten at some point, so it's something that everybody can relate to and everybody can have access to. And so then that way it just becomes this really strong maker of identity. But yeah, I think it's just something that communities and cultures use to sort of hold on to their history, hold on to their past, and then in that way it just becomes like part of who you are.
Wow, you've touched on so many topics there in your in your response to this just one question. I love what you said about how food is a carrier of identity. And then you went on to describe, the different ways in which that happens. So food cultures, are a part of formulating the social
Mm,
groups and the social dynamics and the habits you mentioned. So
yeah.
the sort of interactions that people will have depending on even, I guess, what you would consider to be manners at a food table and how that differs. And you also mentioned that certain foods make you who you are. Can you give me some examples of certain foods that make you who you are?
I would say rasam, the dish I mentioned before, is definitely one of them because I think it's also like I don't always. You're supposed to eat rasam with rice, but I refuse to do that. I will always just drink it, and I think that's like it's things like that, right? Like you have a dish, and then you have this like memory or this habit associated with it. Like you don't do things the way it's supposed to be done. You do it another way. Because for me, I just like the taste of drinking rasam rather than eating it with rice. So I think it's things like that that also give the viewer like a little peek into like what my life is like. So it then also becomes this like way of showing people who I am and why I do things the way I do and my preferences and my tastes. So yeah, rasam I would say is one. And then there's a lot of Indian like street food dishes that I'm really fond of. There's this dish called pani puri, and then there's this dish called vada pav. So it's a lot of like Indian street food dishes that I just like have really strong memories about. Yeah, I think there's so many other kinds of dishes. Like I would say a good mushroom pasta is also a dish that makes me who I am, or a nice bowl of ramen.
It sounds like ramen reminds me of like student days, right? So,
Oh, yeah, exactly. It's
so
such a good, yeah, it's such a good, like, quick meal. Like, yeah, just add a bunch of like protein and then you have like a nice bowl.
yeah, I've certainly come back to the ramen part also as a parent, like
Yeah,
like a lot of having a lot of it during student days, but now also preparing a lot of it as a
yeah,
parent. Like you
yeah,
say, it's
yeah,
quick, it's easy.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Um, and you also mentioned, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about not only how certain foods make us who we are, but certain foods really touch on the power dynamics of that is related to food. Because you mentioned, who gets to eat what and who doesn't.
Mm,
Uh, yeah, can
yeah.
you expand a little bit more about what you meant by that?
I think, I mean, yeah, there's so many, I think, cases or like situations around the world that you could use to explain this. But I think what I could probably have most to say on would be with respect to India and how India as a country is just so diverse and there are so many different communities. But the kind of like, I think, image of like food in India is very upper caste Hindu directed, where people assume that India is very vegetarian and that all the food is like really has no meat or has no eggs. And like that's the kind of like image that people have about India. I think it's also something I've realized since moving to Copenhagen, where I've had conversations with people and they've just naturally assumed that, oh yeah, India, like it must be great for vegetarian food, right? It must be great for vegan food. And while it is not, false that there are many Indian dishes that can be made vegetarian and taste really good, most of the country eats meat, and most of the country like does not abide by this like pure vegetarian ideal that people have set for India. But I think it's because of like um, the government that we have or the kind of like power dynamics that we have in India that make this sort of image come out of it. And this is like, yeah, another example of like the kind of food that some communities can eat and cannot eat, and how that makes them part of that identity again. Because, yeah, I mean, India also has like this caste system and it's still perpetuated. And one of the strongest ways in which it is perpetuated is via food. So, like dictating whether people can eat meat, whether they can eat beef, whether they can eat certain dishes. It's all a way of like forging, or it's all a way of like stratifying people and saying that you should, if you eat this, then you're not part of our community, you're not part of like this caste, and you're not part of like it's all this way of like again perpetuating that system of inequality.
So it sounds like social perceptions around food and what people do and don't eat makes someone either have a connection with them or see someone as a part of an othered group.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I think the word other is such a good, because yeah, it's a way of othering people, right? Saying like if they can eat something versus not. And that's exactly how I would put it as well.
And the kind of the opposite, I guess, of othering would be feeling a sense of belonging and
Yeah.
connection with
Yeah.
people. And in our schools, we seek to be culturally responsive and striving to shift learning and teaching focuses not just on academic, learning and skills and development, but
Yeah.
also the identity conscious development that is needed for us. So, how does this piece of learning influence who I am
Yeah.
and continue to evolve as a person, the same way in which you're saying that food, it's all around us, it's omnipresent, and then it impacts who I am because I'm
Yeah.
constantly evolving through my different influences. Like, as you mentioned, when you moved to Copenhagen, you saw your own identity shift from others' perceptions of and stereotypes of what it would be like to be Indian, right,
Yeah.
as well. And so you're studying and being in academia, and you're seeking to decolonize knowledge and research. So I'd like to ask you, what is the role of language and the way we talk about topics such as food that will play a role in shifting those narratives?
This is a hard one. I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I don't know if there is a perfect answer or the right way of going about this. But I think decolonization in itself as a topic, I think, can be so jarring sometimes to think about, just because it can seem really black and white. But I think the truth is that it's very like multifaceted, and it can be hard to sort of really understand what decolonization is even getting at, because I think all the systems that it seeks to oppose are continuous and they're never going to like truly end, like imperialism, colonialism, like it like still goes on in many different shapes and forms. So it can be hard, I think, especially in like academia, to really sit with what decolonization is and how it can be done. I think the issue is also that a lot of the narratives in which decolonization is embedded in are so jargon heavy, and they can make especially the younger generations just feel really like dissonant with it because it's just not speaking the language of the people, or it's just like getting at really theoretical ideals that people don't have any way of accessing or doing anything about. Like, at least for me, like I end up feeling very sort of despondent or hopeless when there's talk of decolonization happening, and there's just so much rage. Also, there's so much rage and anger, and then it's like, what do I do with all of this, and how do I put it, like where do I put it? And so I think in that way, I think language and tools like food can play a role in shifting that hopelessness and like taking it from there to a more helpful place of like, okay, this is something like food is something I have access to. It's something I can, do something every day with. Like, it's so mundane that I have access to it and everything. And so maybe food can be something via which I do some attempt of decolonization. And again, I think that can also be tricky because it's not like if I stop eating this one food, like I've done decolonization. But I think it's still like you said, I think it's helpful in shifting the narrative from one of like hopelessness to one of like, okay, I can do this one thing, like small step, and maybe it does something a bit better. I think it's also helpful to think about it in that way because then you maybe get a bit closer to really understanding what decolonization is for you and for your community and for your people. And it may not be the same thing for others, but at least it's something that gets you one step closer. I think it's just helpful in taking the conversation to a more helpful place because it's more relatable talking about it via institutions like food. It's just more relatable, more accessible to the people. And I think there's with language also there's so much to be discussed about. English, like I sometimes I feel very hypocritical in a way, like talking about decolonization, but I'm doing it in a very jargon heavy language, or even in English, which is again the language of the colonizers. So then it's like, am I going against my own point? And then I think there's a whole bunch to be discussed there as well about language. But in general, I think there's a lot of scope in it to take the conversation to a more helpful place.
To amplify what you were saying about how language is a tool like food that can shift away from hopelessness.
Yeah.
And and this is like a call to action in a way for people to think about how what does decolonization mean for you, and
Yeah.
you mentioned it's so multifaceted and that people are making meaning for it from their own positionality, and so from you who you are, and so for myself, for example, I was born in Malaysia, but I grew up in Australia because my family migrated there, both colonized countries
Mhm.
like yours. And so what it means for me is going to be completely different, and I'm also of a
Yeah.
different generation, and of different exposures and upbringings and socializations. And also I heard I guess the ironies might be the word of like we're using the colonizers' language to talk about decolonizing.
Yeah.
And so shifting the narrative in some ways could mean the revival and the cultivation of things that we don't want to have die out.
Yeah.
So because something can be so supreme that then other things struggle to survive within that ecosystem. And meanwhile, we're all living it while we're trying to, well, at the same time, dismantle it.
Yeah.
And so that can be really challenging as well. And I know that your specific interest and study is, and if you've written about it, is about how food is weaponized as a tool of settler colonialism. Can you
Mm.
tell us some more about that?
Yeah. I think again, like it sort of ties into what I meant about food being a tool of stratification and dictating formation of social groups. And I think it being a tool of settler colonialism is like, again, like another extreme way of doing that. But I think, yeah, specific to Israel Palestine, where where food has just become this like way for Israel to sort of forge this connectivity to a land that they do not themselves belong to. So like the whole idea of Zionism is that they make a home in Palestine, and I think this sort of food, or like culinary Zionism, if I could call it, sort of gets at this sort of cultural way of doing that, where you use like tools if I were to say, like in general, like people feel connected to their land when there's history to it, when there's like culture to it, like via national anthems or via poetry. And I think food is another one of those ways in which people feel nationalistic. Like, oh yeah, this dish is our national dish, like it's India's national dish. And so I feel like really patriotic about it. So I think food is again one of those ways of like making people feel connected to their land, and it's a way of forging that nationalism. But then the other side of the coin is that then it is also it has potential to become like a weapon for forging that connectivity and for forging that nationalism. So I mean, yeah, in the case of Israel and Palestine, there's so many instances of like cookbooks being published where, it's like Israeli authors and Israeli chefs, but not giving homage to the Palestinian origin of those recipes or the Palestinian origin of those dishes, or even falafel and hummus being like it's gained this sort of reputation or like identity today as like an Israeli dish, but it is not. Like it's a Palestinian dish. It has Arab roots, but it's become this like falafel, I think at one point was also, I think Israel's like national dish. And so for that to happen, it is all indicative of you how like food can become like this way of people staying connected to a land and um culturally sort of taking over and establishing legitimacy.
Sounds to me like there's a way in which people are take claim to certain food concepts or traditions and then kind of say, well, it may belong to the geographical area that I'm now like settling in, and hence I'm going to claim that as my own.
Yeah.
Um, as we mentioned before, as identities evolve, like the food culture comes with it. And so what I'm hearing is when the homage isn't given, when it's appropriated
Yeah.
as a tool of power and oppression,
Yeah.
then it no longer honors
Yeah.
the indigenous cultures
Yeah.
of that place.
I would say also, especially when it's happening alongside real genocide and alongside like real time violence, like then it's really not, yeah, paying homage or giving sort of, or even like, yeah, saying that it's inspired by Palestinian recipes or Palestinian lives. Like it is completely different from, like cultural appropriation and appreciation are like two very different things. So I think that's the kind of distinction that this draws.
You mentioned the terms like culinary Zionism, the way in which food is weaponized, and also being withheld
Yeah.
to perpetuate, well, not just perpetuate, but to sadly to yeah, like in this real time genocide that we're seeing happening and unfolding with food being held at the borders and access not being
Yeah.
so not just claiming a food culture, but also the withholding of access to food and water.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. And thinking about a similar concept related to that that unfolds like all the time, and so it's kind of like we can sort of say that it's also everyday food, power plays that happen. I recall recently, a couple of months ago, Simu Liu and being on like
Mm.
the version of like Shark Tank kind of show, and then
Yeah.
this company wanting to sell boba tea, but not
Mm.
not like you said, not acknowledging or honoring the origins of where it came back, and that kind of like blew up all over social media as
Mm.
well, and playing out and relating to it. And so we see it in all stratas of global politics happening,
Yeah.
and the way in which and its connection to capitalism,
Mm.
and its connections to how people have social access to not just food, but but business money, able, like you said, like selling of a cookbook and saying
Yeah.
that it's of one specific nation at the erasure of another,
Hmm.
or selling of a canned drink that
Yeah.
is taking on food culture that isn't one's own without any
Mm.
acknowledgement.
Yeah, I think it's happening on with so many like dishes today. I think even the whole obsession, like there's such an internet, it's become like this internet trend now, like matcha in general, like everybody's having matcha. It's everywhere and it's being infused in like so many different dishes and everybody's gotten obsessed with it. It's become like this point of aestheticness, but it's I very rarely see people actually like acknowledge where matcha is coming from or the history of matcha. And yeah, I think it also happens with so many other, even like with Indian dishes, like there's so many flavors that get taken and get, infused with like other trends, but then there's very little acknowledgement being made to where things are coming from.
And so, what are you hoping to seek to deepen your understanding of, and perhaps shift in some way with your academic research?
I think that's also kind of tough for me to answer right now, especially because I'm still trying to figure out where exactly, like what kind of research I would really want to, like what kind of subset I would really want to focus on. But I think, like I said, I just think it's so intertwined. All of these, like they're not standalone systems. I think there's so much connectivity. I think even like you said, like between capitalism and like food and even like neophobia and like what is the kind of thread that's linking all of this together. So I guess I would like to, yeah, deepen my understanding there, like kind of really, yeah, what like a phenomenon is pointing towards. Like if there is a matcha like obsession, for example, then like how is that saying something else about like capitalism? What is that saying about colonialism? Like I want to be able to deepen my understanding with like those links there because it can seem a bit, I think it can often seem a bit fluffy in that sense, like how these systems are connected, but they are. And I think it can be tough to really sort of understand that link and understand that connection. So I think I'd like to do some more work there. Yeah, I think I'm also interested in like while food is of course like this one aspect that I'm interested in, I'm also interested in like the ugly parts of it, like disgust around food and like how that is sort of, created like because disgust is also, I think it is a social phenomenon more than, I mean, of course, you can have biological reactions to certain things, but I think there is a social side to it as well, like how those reactions are prompted, or if they are influenced by other people, or like by yeah, other communities around you. So I think that's also something I'm interested in, and like would like to do, or like at least get at some sort of research there. Yeah, because I think again, like being disgusted over a food is also a way for people to, pass off hate towards a community, or like or for them to perpetuate a kind of racism again, right? Because you could say that, oh yeah, this dish is disgusting, like this is like something that these people eat, and so it's like, but again, that's a way of like socially distancing yourself from other people and from creating these divisions. Yeah, I think, yeah, there's just so many things that I would like to get more deep into. And yeah, and I think I'm also just at the same time being really aware of the fact that I don't know. Like, I think even right now, everything that I've said, I'm very open to sort of broadening my knowledge with respect to those things and really acknowledging and admitting that I do not, possess like set knowledge on these topics. And I'm aware that these things can keep evolving and keep changing. So I think I'm really also keeping myself open to the possibility of learning something new and my current, I guess, view being disrupted and hopefully improved. And yeah.
And that approach to new ideas and exploring and being able, that's how we can, may see those connections that you're showing for the threads you talked about, and to be able to make kind of new theories to further explore as well in our never-ending learning journeys, and
Yeah.
that can give us insights to how we might be able to interpret, societal interactions, and what makes those phenomenons that can other people But at the same time, at the beginning of our conversation, you talked about how food drew you to the smell of something can draw you to family connection and a sense of belonging. But the same smell when someone doesn't have proximity to that because it's very unfamiliar to them
Yeah.
can be something that's othered, and whatever has power in a social space, it makes one smell either either good or bad, or feel a
Hmm.
sense of belonging or not, or be considered smelly in a bad way, or really fragrant and inviting in another
Yeah.
as well. And so there's a lot of interconnections of how the supreme cultures can dominate spaces,
Hmm.
and how that shifts depending on your culture and context.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Uh, wow. Well, I hope you will come back to this podcast once you're further along with your studies, and maybe share and present with us your findings in some way. We would love
Yeah.
to hear from you again.
Yeah. That
Um,
would be lovely. Yeah.
yeah. And as we close, I'd love to ask you a couple of questions. The first is, what is your go-to comfort food?
I think it changes. Like, I think I have phases with comfort foods depending on where I am. I think since I moved to Copenhagen, it's been dal and rice. So dal just being like lentils, and like with some sort of tempering with like Indian flavors and spices, and then just some rice. And if I can, then some sort of like roasted vegetables on the side. Yeah, I think dal and rice has become my comfort food of late.
And lastly, if you were to cook a Last Supper for someone you treasure, what would you have on the menu?
I think it's also depends on the person. Like I would want to make something that we have had a shared memory over. So like an example is that like with some of my friends back home, like we have a lot of like memories over ramen specifically because like you said, it's such a student meal. So like every night, like sort of making ramen, cracking like an egg onto it, is sort of something we kind of became like a ritual at some point. So I would probably make that ramen. So I don't think it would be something really fancy or like really like something that I only enjoy. I would want to connect it to the person and like make something that we have a memory over or we have nostalgia over. I think that would be, yeah, best way to express love also for someone. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Divya, for your time, and what a great way to end on connections, nostalgia, and love, and the power of food to bring people together.
Thank you so much for having me. It was lovely talking to you.
Thank you to Divya Ravindranath for sharing your food memories, studies, and insights with us today. You can find out more about Divya's work on Instagram at Much Room for Love to explore these intersections of food, culture, and identity further. Before you go, what's one idea from this conversation you're taking back to enhance your practice? Share your thoughts with a friend, colleague, or student. Connect with me on LinkedIn and share your takeaways. If this conversation sparked something for you, share this episode with one colleague who needs to hear it. We release new episodes every couple of weeks during the school year. Subscribe and follow Foodagogy to be informed about what's next this season. Until next time, keep feeding the inclusion conversation. I'm Angeline Au, and xie for tuning into Foodagogy. Foodagogy is produced by EKG Collective, with editing by Jitani Hevio and Kirk McDavitt. Music by Paul Romain and artwork by Svi David. Special thanks to Trisha Friedman and Frank Jung for sharing podcasting expertise and encouraging the birth of Foodagogy.